Hello, everyone. I hope that you're well, and wherever you might be, I hope that you're enjoying the beginning of May and what's hopefully some more pleasant weather. As I'm talking, it's a beautiful day out in La Grande, Oregon, and I'm looking forward to having sunnier days ahead. So let's go ahead and get started on this week. This is week number 5 out of 10. So we're moving right along, and we're approaching the halfway point. Let's get into it. This week, we are looking at the topic of health and science in public. So we'll be talking about some theories related to health and science communication in a public setting, as well as some of the challenges of reaching the public, including the use of media. I also want to let you know that up through the most recent Canvas activities that you completed on Sunday, your grades are otherwise current. So take a look. I've added feedback on your assignments, including the annotated bibliography. Let me know if you have any questions, concerns, or issues related to your grade in the course, and I'd be happy to discuss further. I'd also remind you that next week is the Health and Disparities essay assignment. So I recommend looking ahead, taking a look at that prompt for week number 6. That's asking you to examine a health or science issue that disproportionately impacts the population and communication strategies that could be used to address that population. For example, we might look at members of the LGBTQ+ community in the context of HIV/AIDS and discuss various strategies, health information campaigns, and health efforts designed to support that population. So this week, we are looking at health and science in public. If you are exercise, performing science, a variety of different fields, this is an area that is incredibly relevant and impactful. For example, in health and human performance, this is looking at the ways in which we take the information about health that we know and that we understand and explaining that to a broader audience. We also know in the context of COVID-19 that this is an especially challenging and contentious issue. How is the public informed and made aware about the issue? What are some of the challenges of communicating effectively about this topic? So how do we reach a large audience in health campaigns, including the use of physical and virtual space? And also a broader question, who is the public? Who is the audience to whom we are speaking? What are the values, beliefs, concerns, and challenges that audience is coming from? And how can we develop our campaigns and communication in a way that's responsive and attentive to the needs of those populations? So what this connects to is the idea of mass communication. Mass communication is how we're circulating messages to a large number of people. For instance, you might be taking or have taken a course related to media, including media ethics, that gets into these topics in a bit more detail. But mass communication concerns itself with a variety of different fields. For example, the circulation of messages using things like television, radio, the internet, social media, magazines, advertisements, games, and interactive medium, and more. So there's a variety of ways that we become aware of information. We're in many ways always on and plugged in. We have access to things like phones, tablets, laptops, and other devices that in many ways keep us regularly connected and made updated about issues. If you get something like an Apple News or Google News alert, right, that's oftentimes making you aware about a variety of current events and things going on, which we use regularly when communicating surrounding health and science-related issues. But as we're applying it to the topics for this course, one of the challenges and the through line that you'll notice this week is that mass media, right, the large-scale media reaching audiences, is a double-edged sword. On the one end, it's a friend that's able to provide information to the public to make us aware about issues that can promote health in a way that the larger public might not be aware of otherwise. But on the other end, it can also be an opportunity to spread misinformation, disinformation, and ultimately hurt our ability to advocate for health effectively. So one of the challenges about communicating about science and health effectively is to navigate this difficult and oftentimes treacherous environment. Anytime you go to the comments section of the internet, you see some of the challenges of engaging in mass communication very much at play. One of the challenges as we think about mass media and communication is what's known as the third person effect, right? As pictured here on the right, it's the idea that commercials will never affect my own judgment, they only affect other people. Suggesting the idea that other people are impacted by messages. They watch an episode of Grey's Anatomy and they think that's how the US medical system works, even if it's inaccurate, right? And what we oftentimes forget is how we're influenced by media, including mass media, and our perceptions about health and science issues too. So we might have kind of dramatized portrayals in media. We might have biased news and outlets that is giving us perspectives on these issues in a way that we're not noticing either. So while we don't necessarily recognize our own susceptibility to messages, we think other people are susceptible to that, right? It's not me, they're the ones being impacted. I'm objective, right? In this way, mass media is playing a major role in our health without necessarily realizing the way that it does, the way that it guides our assumptions, our beliefs, our approaches about a variety of health issues. For example, again, dramatized portrayals, carrying somebody on an emergency room, yelling clear and reviving somebody who's near death. A lot of those things don't necessarily play out in the way that it's depicted in a dramatized fashion, but oftentimes we are more likely to believe that it is, and sometimes that can cause issues of miscommunication. This connects to an idea you might be familiar with if you've taken a course such as communication theory, which is cultivation theory, right? This is a theory that emerged to suggest that the more that we're exposed to a media representation of an issue, whether it's fictional or non-fictional, the more likely we are to believe that that portrayal is representative of real life. One example of cultivation theory that's very common is, you might be familiar with the phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. In a lot of news and like local news outlets, right? Generally, there is an emphasis on a lot of very violent stories, people who are hurt, killed, major accidents. And those are highlighted in part because those are the things that get the most attention. People are very anxious, they're very concerned about what's going on. And that media is a way of fulfilling that need. And over the course of that, through greater exposure to an emphasis, perhaps disproportionately so, on violent content, we tend to think the world is a scarier and more violent place. So cultivation theory is suggesting that our exposure changes our attitudes and beliefs through our consumption of media. Media that has a consistent impact on us needs to be consistent. That is, we are constantly being exposed to a form of media that's telling us a story or experience. It has to be frequent, right? We're oftentimes using that media. And there's limited basis for evaluation. In other words, there's not much opportunity to think critically about this issue. Perhaps we are accepting the information as it's given to us, which can impact our understanding of a variety of different topics and issues, whether it's about supplements, whether it's about vaccination, whether it's about COVID-19, right? Those are topics that are in many ways impacted by our use and circulation of media. This also connects to the idea of social comparison theory, right? Or if you're familiar with the classic phrase, the idea of keeping up with the Joneses, or, you know, in a more contemporary context, keeping up with the Kardashians, right? That's the idea of how we are judging ourselves in comparison to people around us. That is, oftentimes we model our health communication and behavior based on what other people are doing. We're a group of friends, you know, and we notice that our friends are interested in plastic surgery or Botox, or we know that we have other friends who are receiving a vaccination or treatment or a preventative procedure, right? We might notice that we're more likely to do that too as a result of matching our behavior with people in a similar position to us. So there are a variety of ways that we notice different shifts in how health communication information reaches people. One of the challenges, of course, is in considering the US medical system and the ways in which drugs and products become communicated to the public. In particular, the use of prescription drugs involves what's known as DTC, or direct consumer advertising. That is, using mass media and marketing rather than physicians who are prescribing medication, right? We are very familiar, I'm sure, with a lot of the advertisements related to products. For instance, you might be familiar with advertisements for products such as Viagra or Cialis, right? And the use of commercials and advertisements for these things, reaching the consumers directly rather than working through a doctor or provider as an intermediary. You might also recognize that these oftentimes include extensive descriptions about side effects and other concerns. This is actually a requirement that comes from the Food and Drug Administration. It requires a fair representation, including the drawbacks of taking something. So, you know, one example I like to draw from is like Lunesta, right, which is a medication that's designed to help with sleep. And then you have the voice that says, you know, In some situations, there are a variety of side effects, including headaches, nausea, bleeding. If you feel any of these major effects, consult a doctor right away. So like the quick speaking as the commercial continues in listing out a variety of concerning side effects is actually a requirement from the FDA. People oftentimes will bring up advertised medicines to show that they know something about health. For example, have you tried taking this medication? Have you tried taking Advil to deal with the pain? Right. So oftentimes we use direct-to-consumer advertising in our day-to-day communication because of the way we see it circulated and suggesting it as a possible solution. And oftentimes direct-to-consumer, the various pharmaceutical companies and industries, right, are oftentimes competing with each other to get people to purchase the direct-to-consumer products that they believe are the best choice out of the ones available. That oftentimes has meant that a lot of these advertising companies become a lot more extreme and perhaps a little bit exaggerated in some of the benefits that they try to suggest. Again, looking at examples such as Viagra and Cialis portraying a sort of family environment or relationship environment that becomes more positive as a result of taking the medication. But direct-to-consumer advertising has a variety of different problems. One of them is that the cost associated with advertising means the medications that people receive are also more expensive, right? It's harder to have more affordable and quality care when so much funding goes toward advertising the product. Another concern here is that people as consumers are going to think that a more expensive medication is going to be a better one, when this is not always the case, right? We suggest that the cost is associated with value. And as we notice, a lot of prices that have been driven up or gouged, such as insulin, those are things that, it's not necessarily the value or the cost it takes to manufacture, rather there's market variables that have caused it to be more expensive. Advertisements have become bolder, right? Sometimes they are claiming things that are not entirely correct or might be distorted, which leads people to believe that something will be more effective than it is. Sometimes there's a preoccupation with health, right? Particularly in marketing products where the actual health benefits are not necessarily causing a beneficial or tangible difference. Again, there was a lot of debate on this topic of genetically modified foods, right? And kind of some of the health impacts related to that. And another issue here is health disparities, right? Who's being advertised to and who's being left out of the process of direct-to-consumer advertising, because sometimes there's demographics that might not be represented in the advertisements and commercials, and audiences that might not be reached. For example, people who don't have a cable subscription, who don't have internet access, who aren't necessarily getting exposed to the same ads or opportunities that they might elsewhere. So when it comes to evaluating claims in medical evidence, right, we want to be careful about things that are like your National Enquirer-esque, like very provocative headlines that are actually not necessarily real, like listening to Elvis cures foot fungus, right? So it's a good idea that we take the wording of advertisements, direct-to-consumer ads, and we've seen this more recently. For example, the use of sponsored TikToks is an example of some of this direct-to-consumer advertising too. Look to the print sources that have more information, and just because medicine is newer, right, it oftentimes will advertise itself as cutting edge. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's better, especially if it's drawing from the same kind of compound or fundamentals. So we have to be careful about the messages that are being conveyed to us in a lot of these advertisements. So it's also important for us to consider some of the aspects of how media represents health, represents what it means to be healthy. There's an excellent book if you're interested in talking about these issues further from the scholar Peter Conrad on the medicalization of society, who maps out how a lot of non-medical conditions have become and portrayed as medical problems. For example, andropause, or the idea of men becoming older, losing hair, having lower testosterone levels, has been treated as a medical problem in need of a medical solution over the last several years. So unrealistic depictions of health through media can be unhealthy. We see this a lot in depictions of incredibly thin people in television, including teenagers, that can lead to unhealthy eating behavior as a result of people wanting to look like the people that they see on TV. Advertisers might also encourage physical appearance, even when it negatively impacts health, right? People who hurt themselves or compromise themselves for the sake of looking a certain way and perpetuating a type of body image. Medicalization, as mentioned, can make what seems to be a normal function, such as hair loss, be seen as a medical problem in need of a medical solution. There are also issues of the appropriateness of communication reaching the audience. For example, sometimes advertisements for things such as alcohol can reach a young audience who's not appropriate for receiving that information. And oftentimes media are concerned with exaggerated and sensational stories, right? Here's this shocking story about how there is this cancer treatment that's experimental but will save lives, right? That often distorts and portrays information in an incorrect and underdeveloped way. So it's important for us to be careful about media coverage, right? Favoring the factual over the sensational. What is the content versus what is the headline, especially in more clickbait-oriented articles. Don't allow ongoing issues to fade from coverage. We've seen this discussed a lot in COVID-19, right? It's still an issue, still impacting populations, but it's not necessarily getting the same attention and coverage, oftentimes out of exhaustion, focusing on other issues, and so on, right? Setting the record straight and using multiple sources is really helpful, right? If you look on the front page of MSNBC and you look on the front page of Fox News, those are going to say very different things. So looking at a variety of different outlets, discussing and dealing with topics is a good way to make sure that you're getting a more holistic understanding of the issue at hand. We also know that there are a variety of media representations that are distorted. For instance, a lot of the ways in which issues of health and mental illness are depicted in media are oftentimes stigmatizing and inaccurate. A good example of this is the M. Night Shyamalan film Split, right, which depicts sort of multiple personality disorder as having this evil serial killer personality that's kept hidden, and the stigmatizing impacts that can have on mental health and mental illness. We know that oftentimes people with disabilities have been portrayed in media as being potentially violent or dangerous, right, a threat to society. Also, infantilization is common when we portray people with disabilities or people who are aging, right? They're people who are treated as their children. We might think about the classic example of Tiny Tim from A Christmas Carol, right? Treating children as if they are, treating people with disabilities like children and like lacking autonomy and decision-making power can, of course, be incredibly detrimental to the lived experiences of disabled populations. And the charity model is oftentimes used too, rather than supporting autonomy. It's about making the person feel good through donating and supporting disability rather than supporting the person and understanding themselves as people. There's been more media representation of sex over the last several years, but there's less discussion and representation of safe sex, which can oftentimes mean that the views and understanding of sex among teenagers can be skewed. And depictions of violence in media, there's a lot of debate here about whether or not violence as it's portrayed in media can actually influence attitudes and lead people to be more violent in real life. A lot of disagreement on this topic, a lot of conflicting results from studies on this, but to recognize that sometimes the way that violence is depicted in a distorted way can potentially carry consequences. So education, right? Media can also be a source of making us more aware and more understanding of a variety of different topics. One of the ways to understand this is the idea of social adaptation theory. In other words, we are taking information from media and we're looking at it in the context of its relevance to our lives and our experiences. We also have the role of entertainomercials, which are entertainment that are using kind of sales pitches within them. Classic example here is of things such as product placement. For example, in Stranger Things, they were drinking New Coke, and Coca-Cola was actually bringing back New Coke as a way of trying to tie itself in and market with the show. Entertainment education is trying to use the entertainment format as a way of benefiting or making us more aware. For example, if you ever watched The Crocodile Hunter or you watch classic shows on programs like Animal Planet, they're designed to educate, but also designed to make it fun and interesting. Education entertainment, right, is using media to educate through entertainment. Again, a lot of children's programming, such as Dora the Explorer, right, are examples of using media to educate. And product placement, right? That means a sponsor or brand is having a product included in that media. Again, a lot of examples of TV shows and films that might prominently display an advertisement or show a car zooming by. Oh, look, it's a Chevy. That might be an example here of how media is trying to engage with public opinion and get people to think a certain way about a product. In addition to that, we have considerations here related to media literacy. This is the idea that we become aware and we become evaluating of media messages that consider how these messages are useful and applicable to our lives. At the informative stage, we learn about a message. Perhaps we're exposed to an advertisement or exposed to a potential treatment for a problem. We analyze and break down perceptions. So if we're looking at alcohol, for instance, how is alcohol being talked about? It's oftentimes being portrayed as a social lubricant. It's allowing people to better connect and engage at parties and social settings. We're breaking down the perception that this is a conducive thing to social environments. We're deconstructing the message and understanding the ways that it's trying to use, for example, lively conversation, portraying attractive people as a way of making it seem desirable. And then the experimental stage is developing new content to better understand the media process, perhaps using something like a personal responsibility frame. We're talking about some of the consequences of alcohol consumption in a way that's designed to be more constructive. There's also the role of parental mediation. That is, when a child is exposed to an advertisement or exposed to a message, breaking down that message and what that message is trying to say is really important. Again, studies suggest that when a parent or family member comes in and talks to the child about the message they're exposed to, right? This television show depicts a lot of teenagers who are very thin. This is not necessarily the only body type, and at times this can be unhealthy, right? Breaking down that message can be really effective. So this week, I'm asking you to take a look at Stewart's piece on media portrayals of mental illness. This is an article that offers a lot of insights about how mental health and mental illness is depicted on screen, particularly the ways in which reality is distorted and represented, and the ways in which how we portray and talk about mental illness can inaccurately represent a range of issues and ultimately hurt people. You might be familiar with the coverage surrounding Britney Spears, including when she decided to shave her head, and also a lot of the discourse surrounding her conservatorship, right? And the ways in which mental illness and mental health have oftentimes been portrayed in a very stigmatizing fashion. While Spears is a celebrity, right, its impacts have affected other people related to mental illness and mental health. So some key insights and ideas that are depicted here, right? In the vast majority of portrayals, mental illness has been seen in a negative way. Oftentimes, it's depicted as somebody who is killing someone, right? Somebody who is sociopathic or hurting other people. And the violence rate depicted among those with mental illness in media is considered to be tenfold compared to those without mental illness. Again, showing us the distorted representations that oftentimes are not aligned with the reality of living with mental illness. Instead, a study that was conducted at the a national level study was found in examining the experiences of mental illness. Only 2.9% had committed violent acts, and that's compared to 0.8% with no serious mental illness or substance disorders, and 10% with both serious mental illness and substance, which helps us to understand how mental illness, when it's connected to other types of disorders and abuse, right, that's an issue that's worth exploring and understanding better, but the reality of the experience of mental illness is not the way that media depicts it as being inherently violent or destructive. Rather, it's a set of people with a unique set of challenges and issues and needs for support that are not necessarily being represented with that degree of nuance. And according to the APA, one thing that's found is the environmental factors. Discharging patients without substance abuse have lower rates of violence, and the neighborhoods are able to have better support, right? They're considered safer and lower crime. Then they're more supportive of people who are suffering from mental illness. So environment, context, and resources are impacting violence regardless of whether or not someone is living with mental illness. And what we know is that when this is portrayed in a negative and stigmatizing way, this can reinforce more hostile attitudes. We tend to be more violent toward people or hostile toward people who are mentally ill as a result of seeing this depicted on television. Presumption that mentally ill people are dangerous or harmful is seen as another risk factor, and that treatments are viewed more regularly as a result of how it's depicted in media, and we tend to overestimate violence from people who are mentally ill. Again, the experiences of people of color with law enforcement is an example here of some of the challenges and how we depict, talk about, and debate some of these issues surrounding mental health and mental illness too. And many report that family and friends treat them differently due to how media coverage is surrounding the issue. People with mental illness oftentimes are fearful and blame media as a result of stigmatization. So possible solution presented here is that by portraying media as an ally, providing more positive portrayals of mental illness and mental health, providing a greater range of experiences and real stories to destigmatize mental illness, and providing a greater emphasis on forms of support and medication, this can be much more positive. There are a variety of different examples, including media examples. One example is there's a popular video game that came out a few years ago called Celeste. The premise is that it's a young woman who is climbing up a mountain who experiences anxiety and depression, right? And part of the game is she aligns her breath with a leaf that's rising and falling as a way of coming down from an anxiety or panic attack, right? So we've seen shifts in how media is depicting and talking about mental illness and mental health. So it's important for us to situate those discussions in a way that allows us to recognize we're dealing with people who have an array of challenges and concerns. So next I want to talk about a piece that I worked on with a variety of colleagues. I'm part of a interdisciplinary collaborative group known as Chemical Rhetoric, where we publish research related to the study of rhetoric, communication, and its connection to a variety of science and health-related issues. And one thing that we actually did was we visited a variety of what were considered to be chemical landmarks. In other words, the National Historic Chemical Landmark Program was created to recognize historic achievements in the development of health and science, which deals with how we educate about people, how we use things like space, place, and location for education, and some of the challenges, including gatekeeping, about our understanding of these issues. As a part of this, the American Chemical Society has actually designated a number of sites throughout the country as landmarks in the history of chemistry. We make the argument that there is the use of narratives and storytelling that convey information about science and health to the public. Place, which is the meaning and context that we give to location, and space referring to the physically bounded location in which various inventions and discoveries have happened. We argue through the use of a narrative framing device that these various landmarks and sites of chemical discovery, such as the Jane Addams Hull House, use physical location to tell us about what we do and tell and educate the public about the history of science, development and invention of new products, of new devices and new discoveries that have drastically changed things such as the invention of penicillin, the usage of medicine, the manufacturing of technology and information to reach the broader public. Secondarily, the idea of place as proprietor means that we become participants, we become involved in science through participation and ownership. If you've ever been to the Portland area, OMSI, the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, is a great example of this. It is a large space that not only has a variety of exhibits, but it's highly interactive. Kids are doing things like they're building boats that kind of get carried on the water through the wind. They're doing a variety of experiments that show science and show these things in action, which is a useful device to educate the public about a variety of health and science issues. Finally, we recognize that this can be a gatekeeper, right? So for example, as part of this project, part of my participatory work, I visited Washington, D.C. in order to find a landmark known as the Bacolyzer, which was in the Smithsonian Institution. And I was looking everywhere for it, and it turned out that the Bakeliter had been put into the archive several years ago, right? So places managing the ownership, what does it mean to be included and be a part, right? Science has the ability to gatekeep public access to information and how that information reaches the broader public. History is not neutral. What history is being told, whose history is being told, how history is being told is crucial here. So reaching the public, educating the public about a variety of issues is deeply connected too. So to wrap up, our key ideas from this week, we took the time to look at public health communication. It's important, but it's not always positive. Media can distort, misrepresent, and skew our understanding of these issues, but it can also inform us. It can make us more aware, and through the use of things such as public relations, making the broader public aware of some of these challenges. And health and science communication can be used effectively to address issues related to stigma and the experiences of stigmatization that people, including those with mental illness, might experience as a direct result of media representation, although media constantly changes and we see a lot of shifts in representation as well. Next week, we are going to shift gears and talk about the topic of caregiving. So look forward to that. Have a great rest of your week. As we get to the midway point of the quarter, enjoy hopefully nicer weather where you're located. And I look forward to reading through your prompts and work this week. Have a good one.